space of time to try and provide you with a brief overview of the Iraq situation, and I will actually come up to the present time, but I won't be saying very much about Assyrian monuments because Dr. Fromm is going to talk to us about those. Well, I think the problems in Iraq really started during the Iraq-Iran war. We need to remember that to put the whole thing into a context. Iraq actually had a very good record of looking after its cultural heritage up until then, probably the best in the whole of the region. But during the war, it didn't have the capacity or the resources to spend money on conserving monuments and protecting archaeological sites, so they started to fall into disrepair. And these problems were exacerbated during the first Gulf War, 1990, when a number of provincial museums were ransacked and some archaeological sites were looted. Now, unfortunately, I think these are all things that are well known to many of you. Unfortunately, lessons were not learned in advance of the Second Gulf War, and coalition troops failed to take any measures to protect museums or archaeological sites. And as is well known, the Iraq Museum itself was looted, and some iconic objects, such as the very famous ivory plaque showing a lioness and an African, are still missing, together with about 8,000 objects from the storerooms. And these include the Iraq Museum's unparalleled collection of cylinder seals. And there was also at that time some looting, although on a much lesser scale, in Mosul Museum. And at the same time, a number of archaeological sites, all in the south of the country, were very badly looted. They include places like Isin, Adab, al-Akharib, and Nippur. And photographs of these sites show surfaces pockmarked with holes, rather like a Swiss cheese or a lunar landscape. And one case that attracted a great deal of attention was Babylon, but the problem here was of a different kind. It became the site of a coalition military base known as Camp Alpha. When it was occupied by coalition troops, a good deal of damage was done. And that was the subject of a detailed report published by UNESCO in 2009. So in sum, during this period, there was a lot of damage to Iraqi cultural heritage, but there were also some positive developments. For example, a survey of archaeological sites in southern Iraq in June 2008 seemed to show that the looting had more or less stopped by then, and the World Monuments Fund was given a grant by the US State Department to prepare a detailed survey and management plan for Babylon. Then the Iraq Museum was able to reopen all its galleries last summer, and progress is being made with establishing a new museum for Basra. So it did seem by the spring of last year that some real progress was being made and that the worst was over. I think few people could have predicted the absolute disaster that was about to befall Iraq. On 10th June, as you know, Islamic fundamentalists, variously known as ISIS or Daesh, overran Mosul. They've not only introduced a reign of political terror, but they've embarked on a program of cultural destruction that is unparalleled in modern times. In Mosul, for example, in Mosul itself, in the city, many famous mosques and shrines have been obliterated, apparently on the grounds that they commemorate saints and other famous figures, which is anathema to the fundamentalist interpretation of Sunni Islam favored by ISIS. And more than 50 iconic buildings in Mosul have been destroyed, many of them dating back to the 6th, 7th century AD, and many of them of great historical significance. And this widespread destruction has actually gone largely unnoticed by the Western media. But when we consider that there were more historical monuments in Mosul than in any other city in Iraq, the scale of the disaster does start to become clear. Well, of course, a favorite tactic of ISIS is the release of propaganda videos. I expect you've all seen them. I understand from Vernon that a policy decision was taken not to show any of them today, and I agree with that. But just to say that the first one, released in late February, showed the smashing of stone statues and reliefs in Mosul Museum. There were some Assyrian pieces and some statues from the caravan city of Hatra. And it's unfortunate that early reports about the damage in Mosul Museum suggested that all the pieces which had been damaged, or some of them, were cast. That was certainly not the case. Of about 50 pieces in the museum, only a half dozen or so were actually cast. So their destruction is a very significant loss for cultural heritage. And it's a tragic loss for future generations of visitors to Mosul Museum. And that same video shows fanatics attacking Assyrian human-headed winged bulls in the Nergal Gate at Nineveh. I'm not proposing to say anything about Nimrud. A horrific video released last Saturday showed you the very, very extensive damage that there's been at the site, and anybody who had the strength to watch the video through to the end will see that the site of the Northwest Palace, Ashurnasir's palace at Nimrud, is nothing more now than a pile of rubble. I don't want to speculate too much here about the motivation of those involved in this awful cultural vandalism, but in the last year, the sale of antiquities doesn't seem to have been high on the list of priorities, as if it was, presumably these hooligans wouldn't have been smashing them. Well, I'd just like to conclude very briefly by suggesting a few things that might be done. I know it's the subject of this afternoon's session, but I'd just like to very briefly touch on this now. In my own view, the most important thing is that the United Nations, UNESCO, and the international community should put pressure on those individuals and governments who are thought to be sponsoring ISIS. Put pressure on them to stop supplying money and facilitating what they're doing, but also to issue statements condemning these actions. The second thing to be done is obvious, it's a given, which is to enforce existing regulations and legislation about the trafficking of antiquities. As I said, I don't think that's been the motivation for this recent destruction, but it's certainly true that the looting of archaeological sites from 2003 onwards was in order to obtain antiquities for sale on the market. The third thing to be done, I think this is obvious to everybody, is more education about the value of cultural heritage inside and outside the countries in question. And the fourth thing is for the international community to provide assistance. But I have to say, this is more difficult if and when the Iraq government does recover the occupied areas. It's going to need vast sums of money to tackle the problems, and an army of architectural conservators, restorers, and so on. A huge international relief effort will obviously be needed. Thank you.